Hello everyone, and welcome to part 5 of the Breath of the Wild cel shading tutorial series. So to start off, we're going to go over the elements that go into skin shaders. If you look at the lips and collarbone on Link, you'll see that there is a texture being used to force some of the shadow detail. And the same texture used for the forced shadow detail is also used as a sort of ambient occlusion. You can see when I turn the camera, the texture for the lips and collarbone starts to fade in. The principle is exactly the same as our fade Rimlight, and you can tell because the ambient occlusion texture and the fade Rimlight pop in at the same time when you turn the camera towards the world light source. There's also a system in place where wherever Link gets cold, like when he holds an ice weapon, his face gets a little bit red. And lastly, you'll notice there is a small light reflection on Link's nose that's dependent on his rotation compared to the world light source. So I've gone ahead and put the clothing shader on Link's face and body, but it doesn't look quite right. We also have two new textures. We have a new albedo texture that controls the blush on Link's face when it gets cold out, and also a new ambient occlusion texture that controls our forced shadows. And now what we're going to do is we're going to modify our clothing node group. So we're going to duplicate this node group by hitting the number next to the name of the node group. Now we'll rename this Breath of the Wild Skin Shader. And now we'll go into our new Skin Shader node group. And we'll select everything inside the metal frame, the rubber frame, and also the mixer frame. And we'll hit Control X. And what Control X does is it deletes all of the nodes while also preserving the connection to everything else. We'll go ahead and add a new multiply add node. Set the value to 1, multiply by 5, and then subtract by 1.25. We'll add a new group input, take a blank input and connect it into the multiply add node, and then we'll go to our groups tab, and we'll change this new input to be named Ambient Occlusion. And we'll move it up under the smoothness. And while we're here, let's also get rid of the metal and rubber inputs. And let's not forget to clamp the multiply add node. Let's add a new multiply node and put it in between this multiply add node and the mix RGB multiply. And we'll connect this to the multiply node. Now let's put our ambient occlusion stuff into a frame. I'll name this ambient occlusion. And we'll keep that black. We'll move this all the way over here to make things easier for ourselves. We'll make a new Actually, we'll just copy this multiply node. And we'll connect our ambient occlusion to this multiply node as well. Back out. And now let's take a look at our ambient occlusion texture. Now we can see it is a channel packed texture with the forced shadows being in the red channel and our little nose reflection being in the green channel. So let's get a separate XYZ node and connect our ambient occlusion texture to the XYZ node. And take the X and put it into the ambient occlusion in the skin shader. Now you can see we have our lip detail, we've got our eyebrows detail. And if we go to our neck, we do the same thing. Just switch the clothing shader to the skin shader. And let's check out our AO texture. You can see it's a black and white texture, so we can just plug that right into the ambient occlusion. And there we have our collarbone detail. And now let's go back to our head material. And back to our ambient occlusion. And now let's drag our ambient occlusion back to the start of the node setup. Now we need a new math node. We'll set this to subtract. And we'll put the ambient occlusion into the second input of the subtract node and change the first input to a 1. We'll also copy this subtract node, set it to multiply, connect the two, and we'll go down to our light direction camera space, take the Z output, drag it all the way up here into the multiply node. We'll just move this stuff over a little bit to give ourselves some room. And then we'll add a new mix RGB node and put it between the albedo and the base world light. We'll set this to multiply. And we'll take our multiply node here and connect it into the factor of the multiply node. Add a value node, set it to 0.5, and plug it into the multiply node. And now you can see, when the light faces the camera, our detail fades in. Another thing we need to do for our skin shader is we need to adjust these sketch lines here. On the skin shader, it's way too strong, so we have to go into our node group, and we find our smoothness input in our specular sketch lines. Let's add a new math node and set it to multiply. And we'll put it between the smoothness and this multiply node here. And we'll set the value in this multiply node to 0.35. And that looks good. Next up is the face redness whenever Link gets cold. So let's go into our skin shader node group. Let's move our group input to the side a bit to make ourselves some room. And we'll add a new mix RGB node and put it in the albedo. And we'll switch this to multiply. Turn the factor all the way up. And we'll change color to a bright red. So you can see his entire face turns reddish. And then we'll drag a new blank input into the factor of the multiply node. Go to our group tab. And we'll change this to skin red. That'd be skin redness. And we'll add a new math node. Set it to subtract, and connect the skin redness to the second input on the subtract node. Set the first input to 1, and this will just invert the texture for putting it into the multiply node. Now we'll go back, find our skin redness texture, and connect that into the skin redness input. Now we have our little blush here. But we don't want that on all the time, so we can just unplug that. Let's also move the skin redness input up just below the transparency input. Now we'll put all of this into a frame. Let's get Redness. Make it like a pinkish. And let's also put our shadow detail node set up into a frame. And we can make this like a dark teal. And lastly, for our skin shader, we're going to be working with our skin shine mask here. So we're going to go into our shader. We'll add a new math node, and we'll take our light direction vector Z output, plug it into the math node, set the math node to multiply, set it to -1 and clamp it, duplicate this and set it to subtract. We will take our layer weight facing output, plug it into the second input on the subtract node, set this to 0.25, duplicate this, make it into a multiply node, and multiply these two together Then we'll make another multiply node. Set this to multiply by 10,000. Duplicate that. We will add a new multiply add node. And we will set the value to 0. We'll change the multiply to times 5 and add by negative 1.25. Let's add a new group input node. And we'll take our blank input, plug it into the value. Go back to our group tab and rename it Skin Shine. And we'll move it up just under the skin redness. Control H. Now we'll connect this into the multiply node. And now let's add a new mix RGB node right in front of the skin redness. Set it to multiply. We'll add a new value node and make it 1.2. Plug that into the color 2 input in the multiply node. And we'll take our setup over here and drag that up to the factor of the multiply node. And now we'll back out of our node group. And we will see the Y output of the separate XYZ and plug that into the skin shine. Now you can see we have our skin shine on the nose here. And now let's just put our node setup into a frame. And we'll name the frame Skin Shine. Make the color like a peach. Scooch everything over a bit. There we go. One thing to note before we move on, if we turn the light directly towards Link's back, there is an issue where the back Rimlight causes a weird light to form on Link's nose due to a substitution we had to make because Blender doesn't have light groups in EEVEE yet. So once we have the feature, I will update the shader to make the effect work more properly. Moving on, we need to take a look at hair shaders. There isn't a lot going on with this, it's basically just a clothing shader, and we are reusing the fake specular setup we made earlier. The only difference is we are taking that specular and layering it just like we did with the metal, where we have the highlight, and then a smaller version of the highlight on top of that. The only real difference here is that our specular cuts off just before the shadowy part of the hair, so it never crosses over. Okay, so I've gone ahead and put our clothing shader on the hair already, and you can see it's pretty much almost there. We just have to tweak it a little bit. So let's go to our clothing shader, let's make a new copy of it, and let's rename it the Wild Hair Shader. And then we'll go inside the node group, and we will select the sketch line setup, the metal setup, the rubber setup. We'll select the mixer setup and the emission. And we'll hit Control X, and that'll delete all of that. And now we'll add a new Mix RGB node. We will connect that from the Fade Rimlight to the Mix node. We'll connect this to the second multiply node in the color tint and the second multiply node in the indirect lighting tint. Set this to multiply, and then set the factor to 1.0. Now let's add a new math node, set it to multiply add, and bring this all the way down to our light direction vector. Let's grab the Z output, connect it to the multiply add, clamp it, multiply it by 10,000, and then subtract by 1,000. We'll duplicate that, and we'll go down here to our specular vector, and we'll take the Z output and plug it into the multiply add node. We'll duplicate that now, plug the Z output into it again, and we will keep this at multiply by 10,000, but we will subtract by 9,000. So now we have our specular highlight here, and a smaller version of it. Now let's make a new multiply node. Connect the multiply add to the multiply node, multiply by 0.5, duplicate that, set it to add, and we'll add the lower multiply add node, put it into the add node. Now we'll make a new multiply and take this multiply add node from the light direction vector and plug that into the multiply node. Make a new node, set it to add 1, and make sure this is unclamped. And now we'll take all of this and drag it over to our multiply node up here, and we will connect that into color 2. And now you'll see we have our specular highlights all set up. And now let's just get all of this into a frame. We'll make this frame a nice blondish color. And we'll rename this Hair Specular. We'll also go into our group settings, and we'll delete the metal input, the rubber input, the emission color. And that should do it for the hair. And lastly, we have our eye shaders. Now, the shader isn't terribly complicated, there aren't any rim lights, and there are no specular highlights. However, there is a little eye glint texture that seems to rotate in a way that is always pointing towards the world light. So if I turn towards the sun, you can see 2 little white dots in the eyes that always seem to line up to point towards the sun at all times. And even if I turn the camera, you can see that eye glint still maintains the direction pointing towards the sunlight. And even when the moon goes down and the world light switches to the sun, the eye glint will quickly swap to the sun. Okay, so I've gone ahead and put our clothing shader onto our eyeball here. And you'll also notice we have a new texture here that sort of fakes the shadow coming from the eyelash onto the eyeball. So now let's go ahead and make a new copy of our clothing shader and rename it to Breath of the Wild Eye Shader. And we'll go into our node group. We will select our emission setup, the metal and rubber sketch mixer, select the sketch lines, the metal, the rubber, select the fade rim light, vector sunlight rim light. We'll also select the back rim light. We'll hit Control X to get rid of all of that stuff because we don't need it. And now we'll open the group tab again, and we will delete our smoothness input, metal, rubber, emission, and emission color. And now that our shader has been simplified down like this, let's actually go back and take the opportunity to duplicate this shader, make a new copy, and we will name it Breath of the Wild Eyelash Shader for when we work on those in a second. And we can go back into our node group. We'll go down to the bottom here and add in a new image texture. We'll want to grab this eye glint texture here. I'll leave a download for this in the video description. Now let's add a new Mix RGB node, connect the color output of the texture into color 2 of the mix node, and take the alpha channel and plug it into the factor. And we'll bring the mix node all the way up here. We'll connect our albedo from the group input and plug it into color 1. And we'll take the output of the mix node and plug it into the multiply node in the base world light in the color 1 input. And you can see that we actually have our eye glint here, but it doesn't really move side to side like it does in the game, so we're going to work on that right now. We'll also make sure that our texture is set to channel packed. Next, let's add a new geometry node, and we'll add a vector rotate node. We'll connect the incoming output into the vector. We'll also switch this to z-axis, invert it, and now we'll go up to our orbital specular setup, and we will take the value node here with our driver and bring it all the way down into the angle of the vector rotate node. Scooch this over, and now we'll add a separate XYZ node, connect the vector rotate to it, make a new math node, keep it set to add, and we'll take the X output and plug it into the first input there. We'll also keep that at plus 0.5. Scooch this over a bit more actually. Now we'll add a new UV map node, and we will duplicate this vector rotate node over here. Keep it at z-axis, but turn off the invert. Plug the add node into the angle, and plug the UV map node into the vector. And now we'll plug this into our eye glint texture here, and we'll also set the center to 0.5. Now you can see our eye glint rotates. So if I change the position of the sun, let's angle this directly towards Link's face, and you can see it's pointing straight up. Now if I rotate it a little bit to the left here, you'll see the direction of the sunlight's coming from this direction, so the eye is saying that the light is coming from that direction as well. Now let's go back into the eye node group so we can set up that fake eyeshadow texture. Let's make a new group input. We'll name it eyeshadow. Let's also duplicate this mixed node here and put it just before. Set it to multiply. Turn the factor to 1.0. We'll take the eyeshadow texture and plug that into color 2. We'll back out, and then we'll connect our eyeshadow texture to the eyeshadow input. And now you can see our forced shadow has been applied to the eyeball. Let's just go ahead and delete this eyelash shader from our material as well, because we don't need it here in the eye material. And now we'll select all of our nodes set up here in the eye, copy it, select everything in the other eye, delete it, and then Control V to paste it all. And now you'll notice the other eye, the eye glint is actually not working quite right. And the reason for that is if we select both of our eyes here and go to the UV editor, we can see one eye is actually higher up on the UVs than the other. So we have to correct for this now. So we'll exit out of edit mode and select the right eye. We'll name the shader Breath of the Wild Eye Shader .R for right, and then we'll select the other eye, make a new copy of the node, make it .L for left. Now we'll go into our node group in the .L. We'll take our z-axis vector rotate node here, and we'll take the y input and set it to -0.5. Now, that corrects it. And finally, the last shader we'll be working on is the eyelash shader. Now I've got the clothing shader and everything already set up here, so we'll just replace the clothing shader with the eyelash shader we made before. And we'll take a look at our albedo texture, and we'll see that we have our alpha transparency in here. So we'll connect the alpha to the transparency input of the eyelash shader, and we'll change the blend mode to alpha clip, and we'll also change the shadow mode to alpha clip as well. And with that, all of our shaders are complete. And now you can copy and paste these shaders onto anything, whether it's Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom. So thank you guys very much for sticking with me until the end, and I hope you all learned something.